Hello?
Hi Nina,
Hey,
how's it going?
it's going well, thanks.
Um, Welcome everyone to another of the Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology's educational webinar series. I'm feel very happy tonight to be able to go in a direction of my own desires. I didn't let it be guided by what I thought would be what anyone else wanted, but was something that I wanted because here at Penn State, where I work, I got a chance to hear one of Nina Jablonski's talks about human pigmentation, a whole hour long talk, and it was fantastic. It was awesome. Really, a lot of things that I had sort of half heard about really connected, and was super interesting. And I also have had the chance to hear Bryce Robinson talk about red-tailed hawks at the State College Bird Club, and I sort of thought to myself, I wish I could hear both of them talk together and just talk about the connections between, the similarities and differences between pigment variation between, dark red tails and dark people and, light red tails, light people. And, there's stuff to be said there. I think it'd be an interesting conversation. I've hosted lots of bird club presentations and stuff, and I've never asked an anthropologist to come talk, and I've never asked two people with totally different backgrounds to talk at the same time. Not really a panel style in my wheelhouse, but I'm really excited for it. It's happening just because I think the content is right up my alley, and I hope whoever is out there appreciates it the same way that I'm sure I will. Feel free to fire away with the question and answer. If a lot of the people on the list know me personally, I think the Q&A will work, and you can treat it as a chat. We'll probably just wait and accumulate the questions towards the end. Like Nina's going to talk first, and she doesn't have to be reading the questions as they come in. We can sort of let them grow, and then Bryce will talk next. Probably keep it fairly short, so that there should be hopefully lots of time for lots of questions about anything related to people and birds and pigments and so on. So thank you guys so much for being here and indulging my little fantasy, and hope hope that you guys can just take it away and say whatever comes to your mind on this topic.
That's wonderful, Joe. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this unusual but wonderful meeting. And welcome to all the people who might be listening to this webinar. It's wonderful to have you out in the audience listening to a topic close to, I think, many people's hearts, but in different ways. Talking about pigmentation, there are so many interesting things about pigmentation in nature, and we're just going to be taking sort of two big sort of groups of organisms, humans, past and present, and birds, mostly present, but I'm going to bring a little one from the past right into the beginning of my talk. And we're going to see where some similarities and differences are in why they are pigmented, where they're pigmented, and how they're pigmented. So, normally I talk, as Joe said, about the evolution and meaning of human skin pigmentation, all sorts of stuff about the meaning biologically, health-wise, and socially. But tonight, I'm going to take a little bit different tack, and I've got a little set of friends here, some beautiful South African Pleistocene. This is a reconstruction of Pleistocene lovebirds from South Africa who have kept my little Homo erectus figure here in the center of the stage company for the evening. Now, when we look at modern people today from the back, uh, they come in a range of different sepia colors, from quite dark to quite light. None of them is really black or white, but lots of different shades of brown. And the colors of the scalp hair are a little bit more interesting, but within the same range, including some more extreme variation in the blonde and red hair, uh, but by bird standards, still fairly modest. So, really, they're unusual, even by primate standards. And why I say that is I invited my friend, the Duke Langer from South Vietnam, who has these beautiful color fields. This is a male, adult male, Duke Langer, who is, and the females are very, very similarly colored. They have bright red shanks, black thighs, gray shoulders and trunk, white forearms, very distinctive crown, face, and beard frills. Highly distinctive regional coloration, almost bird-like if they had feathers. And there are many monkey species, both Old World monkeys and New World monkeys, that have similarly exciting regional patterns of pigmentation that we're now beginning to understand a lot about. So, but the Duke is here saying, most humans, and by primate standards certainly, are boring. Now, where did this boringness come from? Um, I'm shown on this modified cladogram in the middle of four apes. There are, oops, let me just, sorry, just was a bit too radical there. Um, so there's my cousin, the gorilla, the bonobo, common chimpanzee. These are all of them and me, these are African apes. And what's so interesting about the African apes, our closest relatives, and our next closest relative, the orangutan in his beautiful orange coat here, is that they have no regional pigmentation whatsoever. They have lost all of their color fields that we see in gibbons and in monkeys, also shown on this cladogram. And we still don't know exactly why this occurred, but there is no color differentiation, at least very much, to speak of, although there is a difference in the graying pattern in older individuals, and there's a difference in the coat length, but there's no difference in the pigmentation. So, for some reason, in the big apes, probably around 20 to 25 million years ago, the lineage that eventually would include humans lost regional pigmentation. So, what happened in the human lineage? To make a long and interesting story short, we diverged from our common ancestor, the chimpanzees, 7 to 8 million years ago, maybe a little bit more. And the common ancestor of chimps and humans almost certainly looked quite chimp-like, with dark hair covering pale skin. But over the course of several million years of early hominin evolution, hominins became larger, more mobile, and we see great changes occurring around 2 to 3 million years ago as one lineage becomes particularly long-legged and relatively large-brained. That is the lineage of the genus Homo, to which we belong. And this beautiful reconstruction shows an early member of the genus Homo, done a reconstruction done by the paleo artist John Gurche. What this shows is an individual who has mostly lost its coat of ape hair. And it has lost its coat of ape hair because we have inferred from all the other evidence that we have, skeletal and paleoclimatic and other paleoenvironmental evidence, that this hominin was actually walking and running fast and that it actually lost most of its hair in order to accommodate more eccrine sweat glands to keep the organism cool while it was active in the hot African, mostly savanna environments in which it was living. All of these early ancestors of humans hail from equatorial and northeastern Africa, and they lived under intense sun. And so it was extremely important for them to be able to lose body heat, especially when they were exercising. And when you've got a relatively big brain and no other means of keeping cool, you basically have to have good radiant and evaporative heating and cooling going through your skin. So, under the hot African sun, what is going on? Of course, all organisms that live in terrestrial and sort of shallow water environments are very much influenced by the sun, and humans are influenced by many wavelengths of solar radiation. We have in our work focused on the role of ultraviolet radiation in in the, well, really as being the primary causative agent in the evolution of human skin pigmentation, and specifically in the evolution of protective pigmentation. This is going to be a theme for the next few minutes. This map created by my husband and collaborator George Chaplin, and which has appeared in several of our publications, shows annual average UV minimal erythemal dose is a medical term that is basically similar to UVB, that is relatively shortwave UV radiation that penetrates the Earth's atmosphere very, very strongly, as you can see here, at equatorial latitudes. These hot pink and red areas show areas of very intense annual UVB, whereas the increasingly cool shades grading to gray closer to the poles show incrementally lower UVB. Note how much of the northern hemisphere, that's us, is in this gray zone right now. Okay. So even on a sunny day, we're not getting very much, if any, UVB in much of North America. In fact, very, very little in northeastern latitudes. Anyway, our ancestors living in equatorial Africa were bathed under this very intense UV radiation. And it is under those conditions that we see the evolution at the same time of loss of most body hair and increase in eccrine sweating combined with increase in permanent melanin, specifically eumelanin pigmentation on the exposed areas of the body. This is what I call my favorite graphic, the hairy timeline of human evolution. So here is our guy and his partner, sort of in full length, early members of the genus Homo, active, striding, running, bipedal hominins, just, going for broke, doing lots of interesting things, foraging, scavenging, probably a little bit of hunting, although these individuals probably weren't nearly as active hunters as later hominins were. Eumelanin is a pigment that both Bryce and I are going to be dwelling on because of its myriad interesting and actually fascinating properties for organisms. I'm really focusing on it because eumelanin lavishly absorbs visible light, making it very dark. When we look at sort of a native bunch of eumelanin, it's extremely dark, very dark brown, almost black. But really importantly, it absorbs UV wavelengths and even shorter wavelengths just as generously. So it's this sort of optical sponge, as it were, and it has the ability to sort of uncurl as it absorbs some of these energies and and then can release the energy again. So it's a remarkable molecule, and it has been used lavishly in evolution. In primates and in humans especially, it is used because it is an excellent natural sunscreen. It protects exposed skin from many of the dangerous and actually life-threatening problems caused by very strong and prolonged exposure to very strong sunlight, especially UV-containing sunlight. So we can understand from that explanation why we see the evolution of dark pigmentation in our ancient ancestors. And if you follow that hairy timeline to the present day, actually the ancestors of Homo sapiens emerging 300,000 years ago in Africa had dark pigmentation. All of our shared ancestors had dark pigmentation. And then coming to the present day, all of the different groups of Homo sapiens in Africa have varying degrees and shades of dark pigmentation. Highly diverse, it's not monolithic at all, but it is generally very dark. So when we look around in, if we could look at the audience today or look around where most of us live, of course, we find people with a wide variety of different skin colors, and many people who look like the young woman on the right with very light skin pigmentation. How did this come about? Well, again, this is a story about natural selection. So we have our friendly UV map here, and with humans beginning, modern humans originating around 300,000 years ago, almost the first 200,000 years is spent in Africa only, with the early populations going across the Afro-Arabian Peninsula around 100 to 70,000 years ago, and thence into Southeast Asia, and then populations going into Western Europe, Eastern Asia, and the Americas in the last 40 to 30 to 10,000 years. I won't go into all the details, but suffice it to say, a lot of exciting stuff happened here. You've got modern people who were very culturally competent, who were dispersing via various means into these areas, many of which had lower levels of intense UV radiation and highly seasonal UV radiation. And so they were subjected to very different natural selective forces in the environment, the sunlight, the heat, and precipitation, of course. So what happens when people are going into these very high latitudes? It turns out that at those latitudes, there is not enough UVB in the sunlight to bring about the production of vitamin D in the skin, which has been through human history the major way in which humans get their essential vitamin D. And so the first step in making sure that people could get enough vitamin D was basically to have quite strong natural selection to actually reduce the amount of eumelanin pigmentation in the skin. So, I call it evolutionary depigmentation. This isn't anything pathological. But basically, these two folks, my husband on the left and our friend Habib on the right, working in Ethiopia, my husband can make a lot of vitamin D quickly under the Ethiopian sun. Habib can make a lot of vitamin D, but not quite as quickly because he's got more eumelanin natural sunscreen. So this explains a lot about the evolution of pigmentation diversity in human skin. And what geneticists, I'm not a geneticist, but what my colleagues in genetics and genomics and bioinformatics have shown in the last few years is that there has been quite lavish parallel evolution of skin pigmentation, especially depigmentation, in different human lineages. Western Europeans and Eastern Asians are a classic example of having different genes and different alleles of those genes contribute to the loss of eumelanin pigmentation. And this is because the pigmentation pathways involved in sort of making melanin pigments and packaging them and guaranteeing their transport in the skin, all of these processes are extremely complex and all controlled genetically by this wonderful complex diagram, and which you can find in many different forms online. Suffice it to say that even though human skin pigmentation is boring, when you look at the gross phenotype, under the hood, as it were, it's not boring because there are just so many ways that you can manipulate it. And what this has meant in human evolution is that there are so many ways where you can get the same color through different manipulations of the pigment production pathways or through the packaging of melanin, eumelanin, or the yellow-red pheomelanin itself. So this is really cool, and this is ongoing research being done in Penn State and many other places. It's very, very interesting. So the short story of human skin pigmentation is that it's an evolutionary compromise between the needs of protecting against intense UV closer to the equator and allowing some photosynthesis of vitamin D and near the poles as much as possible under uh, highly seasonal UVB conditions or where there's very, very little in the sunlight, even under summer conditions. So this makes skin pigmentation into a wonderful lesson in natural selection for kids. And this is one of the things that I talk about all the time with kids' audiences and writing kids' books, because when people ask, well, what examples do we have of natural selection in humans? It's like everybody's got it. They're wearing it. You know, you can talk about it right now. So it's a great thing to talk about. And this leads to something that I spend a lot of time talking about in other lectures, but won't talk about here, is that skin color, although it has been used in the past by Linnaeus and other taxonomists and natural historians and philosophers to classify humans into groups and into some races, skin color has no value because it has evolved. Similar skin colors have evolved independently so many times under natural selection and in recent centuries as a result of all of the genetic admixture that we see going on as people move around the world and have children with one another. So it's a cool story, but it's quite different from birds, I would say. So I'm going to leave it now to Bryce. Thanks, Joe, for having this inspiration. And anybody who wants to get all chapter and verse on my stuff can go to any one of my websites or email me. I'm easy to find. There's a lot of my presentations and other stuff online, so you can get all the deep story should you want it there.
Fantastic. Bryce, you want to just jump right in? I think, yeah, cool. You're muted.
Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, we're good. You're
Yeah, can you hear me now?
yeah, good,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Good. Oh,
that's
beautiful.
the second time I've done that today. Nina, that was excellent. I feel like there are so many ways, directions I can go in drawing the parallels uh, of what you talked about with uh, humans, drawing the parallels with birds. Um,
Great.
I we'll go down one of those tracks, and then hopefully we can explore other avenues in the question and answer period. Um, I am currently a postdoctoral researcher with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Um, I'm going to focus on melanin in birds, which is something that I study, and I'll go into that a little bit. Many of you that are here tonight probably know this stuff, but just as a refresher, there are many different pigments that are found throughout the world of birds. Melanins being one of them, perhaps the most ubiquitous. Um, but there are other things like carotenoids that are actually uptaken in the diet of the birds and synthesized by their body after that, that create red and orange and yellows. There are also structural pigments that you see this in blues or greens and purples that are actually created by the pigmentation molecules in the feathers structured a certain way so they refract that light. And then there are lineage specific pigments like the tyrosins that are specific to the turacos that give them their reds and their greens, and psittacofulvins that are specific to the psittaciformes or the parrots that give them their oranges and or the reds and oranges and greens. So the pigments underlying the broad diversity we see in the world of birds are quite diverse themselves. I'm going to focus on the melanins because that's what I study. Melanins in birds come in two forms, and that's really beautifully captured here in this photo of the different morphs of the eastern screech owl, something I also study. Pheomelanin, which Nina touched on, and eumelanin. The difference being essentially pheomelanin is the rusty colors, reddish, um, buffy colors that we see in birds, and eumelins are more of the black, brownish grays that we see. Melanin has its function in birds is variable as well. This photo also beautifully illustrates one of the functions, and that's in crypsis for individual birds, both as predators and prey, background matching and trying to blend in with their environment. And that happens kind of with a complicated um, pattern and coloration in the feathers. That again is really beautifully illustrated in these two screech owls roosting together. Another function of melanin in birds can be seen here in this photo of these two red-tailed hawks that we, members of our working group, particularly Nicole Richardson, took of individuals that we caught on the landscape. The bird in the above picture actually has a plumage aberration, which is a mutation that has basically caused this individual to not have any melanin deposited in any of its feathers. Whereas the bird on the bottom is a heavily pigmented bird, a dark morph, that has a lot of melanin in its feathers. And what you can see here in the feathers on the outside of the wing, you can see in that white individual how worn those feathers are, how really abraded they are. Compare those to that darkly pigmented bird below, and you can see that melanin within the feathers actually provides a structure and strength to prevent wear on these really important parts of the bird's body that are, you know, they're important in their life history and how they make a living, whether that's flying to pursue prey, migration, those types of things. So we see a lot of diversity in how melanin is deposited in the plumage of birds for structural reasons. There are quite a few other reasons why birds or how birds reasons why birds have melanin within their feathers. Melanin plays a pretty big role physiologically for birds, and I'm not going to go into those details, but I can in the discussion about how that relates to some of the things that I study. I study melanin-based plumage variation in birds, particularly in raptors. and I take two approaches to understanding melanin-based variation. One of those is, as Joe has seen me talk about, is trying to understand diversity across the landscape and what different plumage birds means for the relationships of a population, a species, or a subspecies at both of those levels. So how does our perception of these differences, these melanin-based differences in these birds relate to their evolutionary differences or their genetic differences? And then I also focus within populations to look at the same type of variation, broad variation in melanin-based plumages, something that's called plumage polymorphism. And I think a lot of you probably have heard that term and know what it is. For those of you that haven't, plumage polymorphism, which is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of what I present, is essentially just substantial within population variation in plumage that is not by itself explained by either sex or age. Sometimes it's in cooperation with sex or age, but the point is that it varies regardless of those things. Plumage polymorphism in birds is found across the entire avian tree, but it's quite rare. It's only found in about 3.5% of species. In raptors, though, and part of the reason why I focus on raptors, it has a really high rate, and about 20% of the species have this within population variation in plumage that looks something like what you see in this image of the red tails here. Because what this suggests is high rate. This high rate suggests that plumage polymorphism itself has some role in the shared life histories of the species that we consider raptors. And that shared life history is their role as predators. So something in the predator-prey dynamics is supporting this within population variation. When we look at all the families of raptors, it's interesting that not all the families contain plumage polymorphism. Only half of the families that we consider raptors are polymorphic in their plumage. You can see that the families grayed out here don't have any polymorphism. Those families that lack it are actually the smallest of the families. Some of them, like Pandionidae and Sagittariidae, actually only contain one member, one species. So these small families lack polymorphism, whereas the large families are those that contain it. And even more, the largest of the families have the highest rate. So there's something about this diversity, the number of species within a certain group, that also has a role in the rates of polymorphism that we see. Looking at those families that actually have it, you can see that the rate of polymorphism does vary by the families. Falcons in particular have a lower rate than the others, and the strigged owls have the highest rate at about 24% of the species are polymorphic. So I think those really cool patterns across raptors in where we see it and where we don't, or how many of the species have it, really beg the question of why we see this high rate. And because these are predators, they are all predators, suggesting that life history strategy has some role in it. I think that's a little bit of a broad brushstroke in explaining why we see it. So my work focuses on understanding some of the more finer details of instances where we see it and why we see certain patterns. I'm not going to go into all the hypotheses about why we see it in raptors. There are a lot of tested hypotheses that have been put forth. Instead, I'm just going to focus on one species, the tawny owl, to try and help folks understand why we see it in species like this. This is going to focus on the maintenance of polymorphism. I'm not going to focus on how it developed in this species, but I'm certainly willing to talk about that stuff in the discussion section. The tawny owl is a really cool species to look at because it's received, relative to all other raptors, it and the barn owl have received the most research focus on understanding its plumage polymorphism. So all these publications that have tested hypotheses to understand why we see a rufous and a gray morph in the tawny owl, together, I found help provide some clarity for this species. And so I just wanted to walk you through this idea of balancing selection, because I think this is probably what is occurring in all these species that we see within population plumage variation in these bimodal or multiple discrete morph types. It really boils down to an individual's trait profile. So if you consider that an individual on the landscape can be either gray or rufous, there are a bunch of other traits that come along that studies have shown are associated with those morph types. One being behavior, one being diet. So each morph has different dietary preferences. And then also survival in different climates has been shown to be associated with morph type, where grays have higher survival in cool, dry conditions. Rufous types have higher survival in warm, wet conditions. And there are many others in this species. This is just a few of them to try and get you to understand the idea. So with all of these associated traits, you can imagine any individual on the landscape that's experiencing variability in selective pressures over time and over space make a situation where sometimes it is better to be a gray morph and sometimes it is better to be a rufous morph. And that fluctuation in selective pressures shakes out and creates the relative frequencies of these two morph types that we observe on the landscape. This topic, so I study plumage polymorphism, and I recently put out a review on this topic that goes into a lot more detail than what I just very quickly glassed over, including a lot of the hypotheses. So I just put up this code here so you can quickly get through to the paper if you're interested in reading that paper and learning more about this. But for now, I'll just leave it there, and we can have I'd be happy to have a really nice discussion with Nina trying to understand the differences and the similarities between each thing that we study.
Awesome. Thank you, Bryce. And everybody in the audience, I hope the Q&A is set up properly on the webinar, and that you can ask if you want to. Maybe ask a friend of mine to just type in a test question just to prove that it's working and that we're not blocking everybody out. But Bryce, just real quick, what oh, thanks, Julia. Do you want to say anything, even if it's speculative, about why sort of these bimodal things happen? Like, I feel like most of my thinking and understanding about pigment stuff fits really well with the stuff Nina talked about, like these clinal gradients, and sort of you have this spectrum of a lot of little mutations that make things slightly paler and slightly darker over time. Having these like morphs is like really hard for me to think about, like why would it be that way and not just be sort of like a hodgepodge of, you know, a lot of different alleles that just shake out. What are people saying? What are the thoughts?
Well, I can, you know, in now after hearing some of the things that Nina touched on, I kind of wish I had shown a bit about my Eastern screech owl research, because Nina said something that I really resonated with me, and that's that there are multiple pathways for creating the same appearance, the same phenotype.
Mhm.
And for screech owls, that's actually what my genomic work found, that the genomic basis of plumage polymorphism in the eastern screech owl seems to be polygenic, meaning there are multiple genes contributing to it across the genome. And it's epistatic, meaning these genes are interacting to enhance some or to shut off some in certain
Yeah.
instances. And what I think is likely going on is that for every individual, you could have a rufous morph that has multiple different, or let me rephrase that. Multiple rufous morphs might have a different genetic basis for that plumage type because there are multiple ways to create that plumage type. And that can even be thought of the whole genus Megascops because we see that rufous and gray across the entire genus. There's like 16 of the 23 species are polymorphic. Is that all a shared ancestral genomic basis? Probably not. It's probably this this the fact that there's different pathways for creating what we perceive as the same thing, rufous and gray type. But to your question about, yeah, can you remind me exactly what your
Sort of
question?
why do you get
Why is
by
there variance? Yeah.
modality, and why is that better than just having everything blend across,
Mm.
you know,
So the reason I
infinite
brought up,
variants?
yeah, the reason I brought up screech owls is because a couple of the variants that I found that were correlated with the morph types were actually associated with adaptation to different light environments.
Mm.
And we do see somewhat of a clinal variation in plumage polymorphism
Mm.
within species where there are brown types that are basically an intermediate type between rufous and gray, but they occur at really, really low frequencies. Why is that the case? We don't know. And a lot of things we don't really understand. What is the differential selection that's acting to select against those intermediate forms to drive them into these polar opposites? It could be, it's, no, I wouldn't say it could be. It's most likely quite complicated, like a complex dynamic between probably involving physiological things,
Mm.
probably involving natural selection in the environment as well. But the low light environment is a really interesting idea in creating bimodality because if you consider the landscape that these owls are occurring in here in Eastern North America, you get variation in the light cycle, the nighttime light cycle that's
Mm.
associated with the lunar cycle, that's
Mhm.
associated with weather, that's associated with the forest structure. And there's an idea that the rufous coloration is actually filtered out more easily in dark environments. So
Mm.
in some of those situations, it's also sometimes better to be conspicuous, right? So we have to think about that too. But in some situations, rufous types are more cryptic, and in some situations, um, the gray types are more cryptic. So that's probably, the brown morphs are probably somewhere in the middle and not as successful in that variable environment.
Did you see this question from Karen Kefluti come in? What's the time frame for morphs to appear? Is this gradual over generations or something that can show up quickly in changing conditions? Or
Yeah, that's a cool question. Because I think a lot about that. When I first started thinking about evolution and polymorphism was when I was in my master's work with gyrfalcons, and I was thinking a lot about climate change and the changing Arctic and the polymorphism we see in gyrfalcon and how changing precipitation regimes and changing landscape cover and things like that, how they could potentially shift uh, the relative frequencies of the plumage morphs of gyrfalcon over time, assuming that those are adapted to certain
Mm.
things on the environment. And we know that actually selection can shift allele frequencies quite quickly. I mean, within a few generations.
Mm.
So my anticipation is that if selection regimes take a hard shift, that we could very easily see over generations a dramatic shift in more frequencies.
Mhm.
Yeah.
especially in those guys way up there with both a small population and
Yeah.
range that's all getting pressed by this temperature change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm just going to go off-piste a bit to use a snowy ski metaphor right now. Um, One of the reasons that we see such sort of rampant parallel evolution of pigmentation, skin pigmentation in humans, is because in ancient lineages of Homo sapiens, there has been such long periods of population isolation and pronounced population bottlenecks. So when you reduce the genetic variability, including the variability in the potential skin pigmentation genes, it's like, oh, well, how are we going to do that? And and it is really fascinating that you see very different mixtures of genes that assume sort of well, that have some role in pigmentation. In some populations, they may play like no role at all, but in others, they play a major role. So in both loss of pigmentation and in the regaining of pigmentation ability, because as human populations have moved around, first of all, hundreds of thousands of years ago or tens of thousands when they didn't have clothing or very much in the way of shelters and skin was the main event. It was natural selection on skin. And so you see not only depigmentation, but repigmentation events and the evolution of lots of tanning ability that is caused by different complexes of genes in different populations. So this is incredibly interesting, but again, highly contingent, even before we were, causing climate change and, changing the nature of human admixture and so forth. There was just all of these dynamic forces acting, to change the selection landscapes in which humans were living. And in those times, before 10,000 years ago, roughly, we are at the whim of natural selection. We may be culturally quite yes, and technologically fairly sophisticated, but we still basically are having our skin hanging out there in the breeze, regardless of where we're living. So it was quite an exciting time, and it's hard for people to imagine just how tough people were tens of thousands of years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I just struck a thought that I've been thinking a lot about. I study plumage polymorphism in the light dark stuff, but I also,
Mm,
like I was saying, I study plumage trait variation mostly at shallow levels of divergence,
mm,
so subspecies level. And I'm really focusing right now on red-tailed hawks as a system to
yeah,
really look at that. And we see a lot of population uh, related differences in plumage. And in some cases, it's quite drastic. And um, one of the populations that occurs up in the Northwest in mostly Alaska, this population that we call Harlani, is extremely crazy looking when you
mm,
compared to the other red tails. I mean, loss of red in the tail, loss of banding of
wow,
feathers, like just a wild looking bird. And what genetic data over the years and a study that I'm currently finishing up revisions on trying to get published show is that on a genomic level, these things that look incredibly different are just the same on a genomic level, genome wide,
wow,
as birds that breed in
yeah,
Pennsylvania, for instance. Um, and even more, the within population diversity in that plumage ranges from those crazy looking birds to things that we are like, oh, that looks just like a red tail, as a solid red tail, all that stuff. So there's so much of that diversity in there that is a lot of it is related to things that I think about with humans moving around the world as well, because I
yeah,
think that there's a lot of mixing from other populations there, especially
yes,
after whether or not this crazy plumage occurred. It seems to, gene flow kind of muddies it, but it seems to be relatively, it could have occurred in isolation during the Pleistocene.
yeah,
But as it seems now, they're all mixing up, they're all together, but that discrete phenotype persists. And it makes me think of how these melanin-based plumages can be so drastically different in making the appearance of these birds, yet they are genetically almost the same thing.
Yeah, that is really wild because I would have expected some subtle, genomic difference. And I wonder, just wonder what's going on with the gene expression, and just what environmental factors, you know, I mean, who knows, uh, what embryological factors, temperature dependence, who know? I mean, all sorts of things are springing to mind, that might be causing differences in gene expression. Yeah,
Yep.
how cool. Um, I was wondering, Bryce, I've always thought about things like the solid black corvids, uh, ravens and crows, that the that there was actually somewhat a thermoregulatory sort of signal going there because they're so good at thermoregulating, through expansion of their feathers and all the throat action and just they're I mean, basically, they have got sort of in a way the worst possible plumage, but they manage to maintain even body temperature so incredibly well. Are there any other birds that have solid plumage where we can actually talk about pigmentation being selected for on the basis of sort of thermal physiology or some other, sort of gross aspect of environmental physiology like ultraviolet radiation?
Yeah, so the answer is quite complicated. There's been studies that support thermoregulatory benefits for species um, that have a lot of melanin in their plumage. So
Yeah.
they're dark, they have thermoregulatory benefits, but there's a lot of contradictions to that. I mean, just
Hmm.
look at, you know, species that occur in places where thermoregulatory benefits might be helpful, like in the Arctic, right? We see
Yeah.
a lot of dynamics of variable selective pressures and what actually happens
Yeah.
to us to an organism under those. Snowy owl is a great example. Like
Yeah.
if thermoregulatory benefits were really driving pigmentation in birds, we'd see a lot more dark stuff as we go polar,
Yeah.
but we
Yeah.
don't. We almost, but then we see dark. I mean, we see ravens up there as well, right? So,
Yeah.
um, the difference, the reason I think that birds are more complex than other organisms in understanding the thermoregulatory benefits of melanin is feathers. It's just all about feathers.
Yeah.
Feathers are this insane thermoregulatory structure,
Yes, that's right.
right? What we do see going poleward is more dense feathering underneath.
Yeah.
Um, but just the crazy feathers themselves just kind of break that. They break the general patterns in evolution um, because they themselves are the key to thermoregulation in birds.
Yes.
Doesn't
Yes.
doesn't matter what color's your coat when you're wearing a coat.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
Yep.
No, mammalian coats, we like to think of them, in an animal like you know, a mink or even a deer as, fairly complex and sophisticated, but nothing like feathers.
Yeah.
Just totally weak.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. But there's been a lot of I think I don't know the research very well, but there are people that study melanin and integument. Um,
Yeah.
so in birds, I don't really know much about that research, but there's people focused on it. Um, yeah.
Um, Greg asks how many genes are involved in pigmentation determination, whether human or screech owls.
Oh, well, in humans, I can say that as of about a month and a half ago, there had been 154 genes that had been identified as influencing human skin pigmentation alone. And so there are others that can be added for eye and hair. So that's not bad for a boring primate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we underappreciate the genomic concert that goes on for producing particular things.
Yeah,
Uh, we so often oversimplify it. And there are instances of point mutations that are just like on MC1R that just break everything.
yeah,
But that's in the screech owls. There is one gene MITF that I found that is
yeah,
one of those master regulators that definitely
yeah,
a variant that was involved. But there's no number that I can throw out there for screech owls other than that it's a polygenic trait. There's probably hundreds. And the way that studying these types of things from a genetic level goes is we're still in we're working with a lot more data now. We're able to sequence these
hmm,
genomes and get so much information, but it really only provides a perspective on what variation on that genome is
yes,
associated with a trait. We don't really know. There's a certain level of confidence that we don't have in what genes are actually causal. Um,
yes,
that type of work, there are folks that do that type of work in a lab setting with model species like chickens and stuff
yeah,
and ducks that can actually really key in on those
hmm,
exact uh, mechanisms. But for the screech owl, we just kind of
yeah,
explored
Maybe
it.
in 50 years.
Yeah, maybe in 50
yeah.
years.
I mean, what to me, one of the most fascinating things about pigmentation in birds is that there are just so many sort of selective factors that we can bring forth. Yeah, I mean, we just talked briefly about thermoregulation, but you talked, Bryce, in your short lecture about, adding wear resistance to the feathers, because you showed the terminals of the white feathered bird versus the highly melanized bird. That's incredible, that wear resistance that's simply imparted by the eumelanin present, these monster molecules, in the flight feathers of the birds. And then, you have melanin that contributes to whatever patterning a bird might have for whatever reason. And so then there are the myriad selective sort of species identification, sexual selection, ad nauseam reasons why there might be differential patterns and different fields of color, some melanin, some caused by refraction and other pigments, but still, the number of potential selective factors that contribute to the different patterns of melanin distribution in a bird are mind-boggling
Yeah.
compared to what we see in humans, but even in most primates.
Yeah, and it makes it much more complicated to study, right? Like
Yeah.
you mentioned in the African primates how they lost this patch specific variation
Yes.
in color,
Yes.
and and that is something that um is is not very common in birds.
No, no, it's
There
not
are
at all.
yeah,
You know, there,
there
there's
are a few species that I can think of that have more that dark or not across the whole body.
yeah,
But uh, yeah, it's certainly not that because of patterning and then
yeah,
there's so much patch specific coloration in birds.
yes.
Uh, but
Let's throw in Tiffany's question here. On a Winter Raptors survey recently, I saw a red tail that was so noticeably rufous that looking at it naked eye, I thought it was going to be a red shoulder. Once I got bins on it, I saw it was a red tail. Is that normal plumage variation?
yeah, I'm assuming this is in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Tiffany's Central PA.
Okay. Yes, I can make a guess about what type of red tail you saw, but I could be wrong. So if this red tail looked like a fairly typical red tail, but it had a lot of rufous up here in the upper breast, there are a lot of migrants that winter in central PA, and there's this one phenotype that is quite uncommon in this migrant population, Abieticola, in having a really rusty upper breast.
Mm,
The under and it's just patch specific, so it's just that area is solidly rusty. We see that that's actually a subspecies trait for the subspecies allocensis, and then we also see it in the Florida birds Imbrinus. So it seems like something that's built into the possibilities in the whole red tail complex, and for whatever reason, we see it very rarely on these birds that are breeding in the Canadian Eastern Canadian boreal. So that's probably what you saw, but yeah, without seeing a photo, I couldn't say. So that is within population variation, which there is if just totally ignoring plumage polymorphism, there's a substantial amount in red tails. Even in the most simplest, seemingly borealis,
mm,
there's still a lot of individual variation in how much markings they have in their body. And that's also, I think we're trying to figure it out a little bit more, but it also has some sex-specific
mm.
associations as well. One thing that Nina that I have to talk about in plumage polymorphism that kind of relates to, I think, humans is
Mm.
the physiological role that melanin can play in an organism
Yes.
and the associations that melanin products that are part of the melanogenesis pathway
Hmm.
um, play in other very important processes throughout an organism's body. And in birds, one thing that we see a lot of associations in rabbits um, with variations in pigmentation are immunocompetency
Hmm.
and other physiological stress related type stuff. And that's similar, I think, in humans, right?
Yes, although you've hit on a very interesting and very sensitive issue. Uh, People have scrutinized the non sort of pigmentation roles of especially eumelanin in humans, pheomelanin to a lesser extent, but it has, I'll talk about that briefly. But the interesting thing, well, there are a few interesting things. First of all, it's a sensitive topic because some of the differences that have been said to be consistent differences have not been tested thoroughly because they are related to patterns of behavior that people have not investigated thoroughly. Many of these observations were made in the early 20th century when there were many scientific racists who were very eager to demonstrate that melanin had these other, pleiotropic effects on behavior that were negative, deleterious, antisocial, etc. So, like many aspects of human biology, there has been sort of a freeze on this area of research because people they sort of cringed en masse and basically said, we really don't want to investigate this because, how can you do this? How can you set up an experimental or observational paradigm that can be, sort of open, fair, well sampled, etc. Having said that, there are now some better studies that are showing that there are differences, for instance, in pain sensitivity, especially with people who have a lot of pheomelanin. They have many great difficulties when they go to the dentist or have general anesthesia because they require much higher doses of anesthesia to have any analgesic effect. So there clearly are differences, pleiotropic effects of the melanins on other aspects of physiology. but these things in humans anyway have to be investigated with the greatest sort of care and attention to sampling and the nature of the questions, because as soon as you say that, some humans are more susceptible to this type of sort of immune compromise or this type of behavioral stimulation or whatever, it can just so easily blow up. And this is it's one of the worthwhile but also challenging aspects of working on humans, is that you just have to choose your vocabulary carefully and look very carefully at the studies that you are citing, because there are these difficulties with many, especially older studies, having highlighted things simply to sort of flatter the interests of the author, who may have been very opinionated about the inferiority or superiority of the people about whom they were writing.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I wonder, like, when we talk about like how all these different owls have evolved, a gray morph and a red morph, and that different evolutionary trajectories might be able to get there with mutations on different genes. Certainly,
Mm,
there's an underlying metabolic pathway, and it'd be interesting if some of the like behavioral profiling of the
yeah,
redhead-ish owls compared to the grayer owls, like, is it about the net effect of the pathway leading to redness, or is it about just happens to be one of the intermediate enzymes that goes and does some completely other thing, or
yeah,
it's something about pro-opiomelanocortin's other effects on non-melanin synthesis
yeah,
half of the story, and like it's like, is it about the melanin synthesis, or is it
yeah.
about some other spandrel connection that's not essential to it?
So you're essentially asking the question that a lot of folks have asked over
Mm,
time in the plumage polymorphism realm. And the tawny owl, that's why tawny owl is such an interesting species to look at everything that's been published so far, because they've really, a few research groups have really dug into all the possible hypotheses that could it be pleiotropic stuff that, maybe it's not even anything to do with
mm,
how that bird looks on the landscape. Maybe it's about something internally that makes one advantageous and another one not.
mm,
But what the data show, I mean, what in aggregate, all that research shows is that with many of those hypotheses supported, it's probably a combination of all those things. It's
mm,
probably, you know, a lot of factors dancing together to create what we see. And it just seems like we want a simple explanation for it. But, like for the tawny owl, there's a study that showed that Rufus types had higher levels of bloodborne pathogens in them
mm.
because they were hunting in areas that that they were more successful in, but provided them greater exposure to insect-borne
Mm,
pathogens. Um, and there's also studies that show like immunocompetence trials that
mm,
showed that there was a differential thing. The other part that I haven't even touched on that complicates the Tawny Owl story even more is that their sex seems to play a role. And
mm,
sex also seems to play a role for behavioral stuff like boldness or
mm,
shyness, that a Rufus male and a Rufus female don't respond the same way. Uh,
mm,
even in and there is a that generally Rufus and Gray don't respond in the same way, but also the sexes don't. So there's also that complication. So I think to your question, Joe, I think a lot of the cases there's probably more than one thing that are acting on plumage type
yeah.
and all the traits associated with it.
Certainly, certainly it would be a long night to I'm like just about to like hop off with like five more questions, but maybe we can take it to email to respect the time and the audience who's stuck it out so far. Um, but I'd like to just thank you both so much for indulging my fantasy. It's definitely not a normal bird club. Very deep nerd path. But I've greatly appreciated the biology and the big picture of life that we've had this neat
Well,
little
and
world to look
one of
at.
the one of the cool things, Joe, is I think this discussion has been made not only rich because of the people brought together, but because now we just know so much more natural history, and especially the depth that genetic and genomic and bioinformatic research has given us in the last 20 years has been like, oh my God. In addition to all the good physiology that had been done in the past, this has just added these, multiple dimensions that are extremely exciting and that we could continue to unpack in your questions, for probably hours because, trying to figure out why these, mixes and matches and things turned on under certain circumstances or activated, and it, there are just so many questions that remain to be answered. And one of the things that I've realized working on human pigmentation is, you know, nothing's optimal. As long as it works and it reproduces, like, let's go with it.
Yeah. 100%. Yep. I think that has a huge role in what we see on the landscape with birds.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to say thanks for the invitation, Joe, and definitely if anybody out there, wants to talk to me more about this stuff or ask questions, like uh, always feel free to email me. I love talking about this stuff and discussing with people, and that goes for you too, Joe.
Thanks. Yeah, I know
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
already
did.
answered my email questions already, so I know it's true. And yeah, if anybody on YouTube, I can vouch these are both email responsive folks. So it's
Yeah.
fantastic to have this little thinking resource to potentially continue into the future.
Great. Cool. It's been a real pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much for the invitation again.
Thanks so much for honoring it. We greatly appreciate you. Thanks, Nina and Bryce.
Take care. Stay warm.
Yeah, thanks. Bye bye.